So for everyone who's tuned in, my name is Ross Palley, General Manager at Venture Lane. We are a hub and support system for early stage technology companies in the Boston area, and more recently with the full virtualization of our program, early stage technology companies everywhere. Today, we have growth tips and crisis impact stats from over 200 Boston startups. For the past 2 weeks, Venture Lane has been running a recession readiness survey for Boston startups. And this has been with the support of wonderfully supportive partners, Techstars Boston, Accelerator, Bostino, _VC, and First Republic Bank. The purpose of this survey was twofold. Purpose number one, to understand how Boston startups have been impacted economically by the current crisis over the last 60 days or so. And then secondly, and probably more importantly, to kind of pull insights from all of the participating founders to learn what are the critical strategies that will help startups in this time reverse the curve and reclaim their pre-crisis growth trajectories. So that's the purpose of this survey. We've been running it for 2 weeks. And now today, finally, we are ready to unbox some of the key insights that we have from this survey. And it's one thing to collect this data and to collect these learnings. More importantly is to bring together a panel of experts who can help us decipher this data and pull some actionable insights and help us inform our decision-making going forward in order to help us get back to business. So we are joined today by Jay Batson, founding CEO of Acquia, Clement Cazalot, Managing Director of Techstars Boston, and Sarah Hodges, partner at Pillar VC. Jay, Clement, Sarah, welcome. Thank you so much for making the time today. Let's do a quick round of intros. Sarah, maybe we'll start with you. Quickly, your role at Pillar, and maybe current state of affairs at Pillar VC. What's going on with you guys right now?
Sure. So I'm Sarah Hodges. I'm a partner at Pillar. We're an early stage venture fund here in Boston, backing companies based in Boston. Our fund was co-founded by 22 CEOs who built big, enduring companies in our region, and we're really invested in continuing to see the next generation of those companies come up. We're actively investing right now. We're actively meeting with founders right now, but we're certainly shifting our entire approach to digital and trying to figure out what that means for us and for the founders we work with.
Wonderful. Clement, you want to introduce yourself next?
Sure. And by the way, before I start, I want every single digital experience I have to be introduced to you by Ross. That was awesome. That was an awesome high energy intro. I loved it. Hi, everyone. My name is Clement Cazalot. I'm the managing director of Techstars in Boston. It's a startup accelerator, also focused fully on companies leveraging the Boston ecosystem and what Boston is world class at. We actually, given that, to answer your question, what's happening with us. So we're actually accelerating and are going to run programs every 9 months from now on in order to be able to deploy more capital with mentorship, help with more customer introduction to companies in the Boston area right now.
Wonderful. And Jay, you can round us out. What's going on in the world of Jay Batson?
Well, thank you for the intro, Rossi. Definitely, I'll agree with Clement. You are a good facilitator of all this stuff. In addition to being the founding CEO of Acquia, I've also been, though, since 2012, mostly a full-time angel investor and mentor around the city for companies, many of which came through Techstars and many which didn't. Actually, some number of them live inside of Venture Lane, it turns out. And so I spend a lot of time talking to companies as kind of the independent outsider. Though I might be a minor angel investor, I'm often the person on the outside that's helping them navigate conversations with investors. And how do you do that, since I'm kind of the safe place in the middle? So spend a lot of time talking to startups in various stages, probably up through Series B, up until and into Series B.
Wonderful, wonderful. Jay, Clem, thank you so much for the kind words. We've been running 2 to 3 webinars a week at Venture Lane for the past 60 days or so. So we are well into our routine. But let's dig right in.
Wait, you're saying that we're not special? Is that just one more webinar? Dude, don't do that to us. That's a very special one, and you're giving us all your love.
Let me revise that statement. This is actually the most special of the webinars that we've done so far, and for the foreseeable future of all the ones to come. Okay, so what are we going to take a look at today? What is the agenda? We'll start off with some demographics. What is the snapshot of the startups who submitted this survey? And do we feel that it's representative of the startup ecosystem in Greater Boston? Next, we'll look into Runway Health, so we'll understand better for the startups who submitted what their runway status is and learn about some of the strategies that they use to preserve or extend runway in the current climate. After that, we'll look at the crisis impact on growth. So how has revenue been affected across startup ecosystem? And additionally, what are founders' outlook for this prospect of growth, and when do they foresee a return to sort of pre-crisis levels? And then we will finish off with founder strategies. So we pulled insights from all the participating founders. What did they believe are critical strategies for winning new business, retaining customers, and leading their teams through the current climate? So that's what we'll be getting into today, and we'll start off with demographics quickly so we can get to the panel as fast as possible. Overall, we had 216 startups submit their responses to this survey. For the sake of having data insights that we can be confident in and draw conclusions from, we whittled those 216 down based on a few criteria. Are they headquartered in Massachusetts? Are they software-powered solutions? Because as we know, hardware or life science solutions can follow a very, very different set of patterns. And other criteria as well. Are they a high-growth company as opposed to more of a lifestyle business? And then finally, we had one other criteria, which was failing me at the moment, but it'll come back. So we had a few criteria, we whittled it down, and the data that we see from here on out for the hour will be based on a little over 100 of those submissions. So for those submissions, we hit from seed, or really pre-seed, and we'll take a look at funding stage distribution in a second. We went from pre-seed all the way to Series A, reminding me that was our other condition. Beyond Series A, we did not include that in the data insights that are to follow. So this is really looking at the earliest stage in the Boston ecosystem. Pre-seed Series A, product type, we are 100% focused on software-powered solutions rather than hardware or life science solutions. Also an important part of the ecosystem, but for the sake of being able to draw conclusions from the data, focused on software for the time being. Of the 106 startups that we are going to look at data on, primarily customer type is B2B, 68%. And the remaining 32% there, primarily B2B2C, and a very, very small sliver of direct-to-consumer thereafter. Business model, mostly subscriptions, 71%. And of the remaining 29%, we had a bit of transactional and then a small representation of ad-based revenue. And then top industries that we have represented in the survey today, business intelligence tools, financial services, and healthcare are the top 3 industries represented. We'll switch quickly to our next slide. To look at funding stage of the participating startups. And as you can see, we kind of have a funneling down from the earliest stages. We asked startups, how much funding, equity funding have you raised to date? Almost 40% responding 0 to 500K, 15% 500 to $1 million. And you can see sort of a funneling down as we get closer to the Series A range. Natural, as you would consider, you have sort of a much larger pool of earlier stage startups in the ecosystem, and then sort of a whittling down in terms of the ones who are able to find success and make it into later rounds and later stages of funding. So let's go back one slide, and let's turn to our panel now, Clem, Sarah, and Jay. Looking at this information, do we feel that we have good representation of the Boston startup ecosystem as it pertains to industry, as it pertains to customer type, as it pertains to business model? Thoughts there?
It's certainly a good representation of the types of companies you have outlined here. I mean, there are consumer companies and lots of other types of companies that might not fit in these categories, but it's great that you framed the discussion by sharing where the data is centered, so we can kind of zoom in there. But certainly representative of B2B early stage.
For sure. Clem, Jay, any other thoughts?
I mean, Boston is more than that. Like there is indeed like all the life science, the bioinformatics, like the bridge between these two ecosystems that are being more and more prominent. But that's like historically that has been the bread and butter of Boston. We see like there is actually we're super good at consumer, we're super good at so many other stuff than the B2B bread and butter. But that's probably is representing, if you're someone like what Boston is great at in tech, that's probably going to be the answer coming out. So yeah, and thanks for being very explicit on how you distill how you filter the information and all that. So that's great.
Of course. Jay, anything to add?
Nope, keep going.
Great. we have plenty to get through. So, apologies for the pop-up. Let's keep going now. Let's get into Runway Health for the participating startups. This is where we enter we're going to do a little bit of a Rorschach test with our panelists. We're going to show them a series of graphs and say, what do you see here? How does this graph make you feel? So first we ask participating startups, how many months of runway do you currently have? So taking a look at this chart, obviously a little bit of a bell curve forming, the peak being 6 to 12 months of runway. And a little more heavily distributed towards 0 to 6 months of runway in the bank. So right now, knowing what we know about the current climate, having heard from a number of different sources that raising a round of financing might take a bit longer than it has prior to the crisis, any concerns or alarm bells going off taking a look at this chart? Or does everything seem pretty normal? Sarah, we'll go back to you to start.
Yeah, it's certainly weighted fairly heavily towards companies that have less than 6 months of runway, which is concerning given the fact that it might be a more difficult climate to raise a round in. I'd say, speaking from our portfolio, we just have over the last couple of months been looking at how much runway each of our companies have, and I think we have a small handful of companies that need to raise within the next 6 months, and the rest are in this kind of 6 to 12 or 18 and up range. And part of that is because we're an early stage pre-seed and seed stage fund. And so many of our companies either raised from us recently and don't have real revenue pressure because they're so early. And so they haven't been impacted as heavily by, maybe a softening on the sales side. But I think for those companies that are in the 6 month range, it's really an important time to be thinking about what can you do to extend that runway, and then getting really good at meeting with investors over Zoom and learning how to work that process. I think we just did a very brief survey of investors here in Boston to understand if they're actively still investing. And I think we were surprised that almost everyone in the group had made one or more investments since the COVID stay-at-home order. So people still are making investments with new companies here in Boston, but it certainly is a slower process and a new process for a lot of founders to navigate.
Sure. Clem, any additional color to add there? Similar sentiments around the Techstars portfolio of companies compared to Pillar VC?
Yeah, I mean, yes, and we're all at the very start of the discussion. So we have like most of the current class, the last class on market right now raising, and there is this the thing perhaps to add color. Agree with everything that Sarah shared. Like folks are investing is just a very different type of process that sometimes involve more volume of discussions than in the past, and sometimes also discussions that are outside of New York, outside of Boston, going to New York, going to LA, going to SF, going to Chicago, and being much more proactive to bring people from outside of the Boston geography. So that's the thing that has been changing. One thing that we're seeing is, if you're in the 0 to 6 months, think also about alternative source of capital. things that were toxic in the past, there is this black mark of like, don't do consulting, don't do things that the reality right now, the discussion is survive, and that's like step one, survive, step two, go back to step one. And so we see people like in the 0 to 6 in parallel of the fundraising path, looking at actually the government has been very active into like SBIRs process. If you're based in the US, based in Boston, you have access, and heavy intake, there is access to other pool of capitals here. The consulting aspect, being upfront with the clients and actually changing the structure of the deals that you have with the clients, that if you have the luxury of that, in order to extend that. Everyone wants to be in the 12 to plus months of runway. Like we have this remaining months of liquidity is like that KPIs that we track. But the reality is that do whatever it takes to be on the other side of that bell curve. It doesn't have to be by the book, keep selling subscription.
Great. And we'll take a look, excuse me, in just a minute about some of the strategies.
Is that the emotion? Is that what's happening?
Yeah. Oh goodness. We just had so many webinars over the last 60 days. I think we're getting to the
Stop making us not feel special. Like all this audience, everyone here, like that is the one webinar we decided to attend. So anyway, I'll stop my bad jokes.
No, great to have some of the additional strategies for how founders kind of extend the runway right now. Jay, any other strategies come to mind in terms of advice you would have for founders who are trying to preserve runway health and perhaps extend the number of months of runway that they have in the bank?
I guess I have two things to say. One is, I founded my first venture-backed company, Pingtel, during the kind of late 1990s recession, and I founded Acquia in the late aughts, 2000 recession. And in both of those, I'm seeing similar behavior that I see now, which is that those investors who are kind of professional investors who do this for a living are being disciplined and investing kind of constantly. There's, I believe, a belief that we ought to be putting money to work at this point in time to make sure that we continue to build companies, that employees that are coming out of companies might have great ideas and opportunities that would be great for creating new companies. So I think professional investors continue to work apace. A little bit of caution. I think the bar might be a little bit higher now. There might be a little bit more pressure on valuations, coming down a little bit. But in general, I think those investors are being disciplined. I think those smaller investors who might be occasional investors, investors that are angels that aren't full-time angels, that are sometime angels, who think they want to be, investors, but don't do it all the time and don't kind of have the discipline around what it takes to decide on investments or not, have backed off a little bit. So I think if you're the kind of company that's relying on a class of miscellaneous angels, all of whom might write a $25K check, and you just get a whole 10 or 15 of those, that kind of investment strategy might be more challenging. So the things that Clem has talked about are probably more important for those companies to pay attention to in the shorter term, and so forth. And then I think second of all, when the 2001 or 2, whatever it was, recession hit in my first company, I took a pretty deep knife to the company, and it was painful. And in retrospect, if I look back at that era, I don't think I know a single CEO who came through that who cut deeply and said, I shouldn't have cut more deeply. It hurts to do it now because you're getting rid of people and you're having to change what you think you can accomplish and all that kind of stuff. But it's almost like the rule is you can't cut too much. So there's a question about what projects are you working on now that maybe you should refocus away from, go back to core business in some way, and like what all the ideas that Clem had. So it's not necessarily cutting people, it's maybe as much as it is cutting your distractions and making sure you're staying focused on the very thing that they think is going to give you the most traction sooner.
Of course. And in just 2 slides, we're going to take a look at some of the strategies that that founders have used to manage cost and what the impact has been, how many new months RUNWAY has that created? And Jay, curious to get your thoughts on, you think if enough was done overall across the ecosystem, or if you think as someone who's been through a prior downturn or two, if more could have been done. So let's take a quick look at our next slide. One more chart here, continuing the Rorschach test for our panelists. So we also asked founders, when will you start raising your next round of funding? As you can see, not so much of a bell curve. Definitely a little bit of a sense of urgency here. We have more than half of founders responding, saying, in the next 6 months, we'll start a next round. And then the other 50% distributed to 6 months or more. Sarah, Clem, Jay, do we see enough urgency in this chart in terms of when founders plan to start raising their next round, or given the difficulty in raising in the current climate? As Jay mentioned, we might be seeing similar levels of activity at the institutional level with the VCs around town, but for a lot of these earlier stage companies who will be raising from angel investors, and the activity there might be decreased a bit over the last 60 days. Do we see enough urgency here in terms of the planned timelines? Yes, Jay.
I'm going to actually change the question just a little bit in saying that I'm a believer that investors invest as much on relationship as they invest on idea and business opportunity. And so I think it's wise for the companies to start to talk to the investors that they believe would be those that will invest in the company and start to build that relationship. On the other hand, I'm skeptical that there's necessarily enough insight into what the future looks like, and there might be a little bit of it might take a little longer to raise money than people might expect. So starting the relationship now, good idea. Having expectations about when you close might need to adjust a little bit.
Got it. Clem, Sarah, any additional advice for founders as they plan timeline and approach for raising their next round of funding in the current climate?
I think that's great advice from Jay, particularly given that the focus here is on very early stage companies. So much of that investment decision really is about the people who are leading the company. And so taking that time early on to get to know those prospective investors is key. I also think this is a really individual decision at the company level. There are certainly companies that have seen momentum as a result of COVID and this crisis. And we see some of those companies that might have even close to 2 years of runway thinking about starting some of those investor discussions now because, the business is in overdrive and they could use that capital to accelerate and extend their lead right now. And so they're being really opportunistic about thinking about raising. And then, it sounds like we'll get to this a couple of slides from now, but heading out to raise capital isn't the only way to think about injecting the business with cash. There are other tactics that founders can consider as well. And, I think everybody is thinking about really just being tight on burn, no matter what situation they're in. So, it seems like based on this data that there are a number of companies that are kind of accelerating, at least starting those conversations, and that's a good idea. But at the end of the day, it comes down to the individual business and founder and what's right for the company right now.
Yep, makes sense. Clem, anything to add?
Briefly, something slightly tangential to that. I agree with everything was shared. The one thing is because of the data here that is skewed towards pre-seed, seed, earlier stage. So I'm assuming like less than 10 people, less than 5 people sometimes, or like that's like the always be fundraising is actually toxic to the agenda of a CEO of a founding team. So focus. Every company is unique and should be treated as such, and you do what makes sense for your business, but don't over prioritize going out and starting a roadshow if you're not ready. And if this is a shot in the dark, like focus on the business. And if there is inbound discussion, if through discussion you get introduced, then by all means have the discussion, build the relationship. But don't like the market might have been more tender in terms of time and how you allocate your time in the past. Now it's like truly don't overthink. Don't start fundraising if you're not ready to fundraise. Like focus on your business first.
Sure. So readiness being an important factor here. So now let's round out the discussion quickly on Runway Health. So we're going to take a look at some of the strategies that founders use to manage cost in the last 60 days. So we asked everybody, how many months of new runway have you created in the last 60 days? So these were for the months of March and April primarily. 65% responded we created 1 to 3 months of new runway. 24% we created 3 to 6 months of runway, and the remainder greater than 6 months. How did they do this? We asked, did you raise bridge funding? And the specific wording of that question was, have you raised equity funding in the last 60 days that you did not plan on raising prior to the current crisis? Surprising answer there. Panelists, maybe not surprising to you. Only 7% said yes, 93% saying no, we did not raise emergency bridge funding at this time. And then 2 other points to make here, and we'll turn it over to the panelists for insights. We asked, did you apply for a PPP or a similar assistance program? 63% saying yes, 37% saying no. And then, of course, big driver in terms of cost or expenses here, did you change your headcount? Has your team size decreased, stayed the same, or increased in the last 60 days? 28% saying the team decreased, 28% saying the team decreased, 42% saying no change in team size for us, and 30% saying we actually grew the team in the last 60 days. So likely some of the companies that closed rounds of financing prior to the crisis escalating. And one interesting caveat here for some of our smaller teams, so less than 10 people, if the team size changed, if they increase or they decrease, the change on average was 50%. So 50% increase in headcount or 50% decrease. For the larger teams, greater than 10 employees on the team, the change on average is about 20%, so a bit smaller. And that could be 20% in one direction in an increase or 20% in a decrease. So we take it to the panelists, looking at this snapshot of data. First and foremost, do you feel that founders on average were able to create or extend their runway enough? Would you be more confident if you were to see bigger numbers there in the first point? And then any surprises to you in the last 3 points? I know a surprise for us was to see that only 28% of companies surveyed brought down their headcount as a form of cost management. Clem, Sarah, Jay, any thoughts here?
I think it's tough to interpret this data kind of in a tunnel without knowing the broader context. Like, we don't know which percentage of these companies were in a strong cash position to start and didn't need to cut headcount and didn't need to make these adjustments. I think overall, our guidance to companies has been, focus on the milestones that you need to hit that next financing. I think Clem's advice was great advice. Like, don't waste your time thinking about fundraising right now if you don't have kind of the proof points in place to be able to get that round done. And so in those cases, we've encouraged people, like Jay said, to make deep cuts. You don't want to have to come back and make another cut, 6 months from now. That's tough on everyone and tough on the business overall. And so really just think very cautiously about what the business really needs to succeed and to hit those milestones. We're seeing a few companies go out and raise bridge funding right now. We're seeing other companies go out to investors who didn't make it into their last round, who are still hungry and have an appetite for being in the business to potentially open up that last round and, tack on a little bit of extra cash to give them some new runway. But again, I think this comes down to the individual business. And the key is just making sure that you really are creating enough runway and enough room to hit those milestones that you're going to need to get the next round done, knowing that the bar may be a bit higher when you go out to raise.
Got it. Clem, Jay, any color to add?
I mean, nothing to add.
Yeah, this harkens back to the thing we said a couple slides ago that, in 2001, I cut kind of half the company. And I definitely had to live. I really did not want to go through the era of I'll cut 5 people, then 6 months later, oh crap, I need more runway. I'll cut another 7 or 8. It's best to just pull the Band-Aid off. and get focused. And then, if you actually turn out to have a little extra runway, you can go back and add some people back in if you need to. But it's just disheartening for everybody to know whether theirs is going to be the next neck that's going to be underneath the hatchet. And so do it once and do it more than you're comfortable with, and then hire back if you need to in 2-3 months. And so I can't answer whether or not the teams did or did not do enough. I'm in the same boat as Sarah and Clem. That's just so company dependent to know whether that was the right thing or the wrong thing for them to do. So,
of course. So advice from panelists here: cut once, cut deep. So this is not a prolonged or ongoing process. And then make sure that when it comes to runway, the focus is, do we have the necessary runway to hit the milestones that we set out to achieve, and that we've communicated to all of our stakeholders, this is what we plan to achieve in this amount of time.
There's another way to say that, and I use words a little differently than milestones, and they really are the same thing. But the question is not, did you hit a certain number? The question is, you represent as a company a set of potential failure points, ways that you're not going to succeed, things that might kill your business. And you got to figure out how to get past those, what you're going to do to make sure you survive and eliminate those problems. And so milestones are really just a measure of those things which you think you need to figure out. You might decide at a time like this where you're going to have less money to spend and less opportunity to hit them all. Figure out which things are really super essential for you to stay alive, and then focus on those things and spend money to make sure you figure those out in the business.
Great.
I react a little bit sometimes to the word milestones because they can be somewhat arbitrary. The real question is, what are you figuring out that you need to figure out to make sure you can get to the next customer, the next stage of your business?
Great. Important.
I think we're aligned on how we think about milestones, Jay. I just want to add one more thing. I think on this topic of making deep cuts, this is a really difficult thing to do as a founder. It's one of the most difficult things to do. And I think, oftentimes founders hold off on making this really tough decision because you're thinking about the people who you're going to impact. And that's just really, it's a tough pill to swallow. My partner, Russ, wrote a great blog post recently about making cuts. And I thought a really good point in it was that sometimes when you make those cuts, it's actually in the best interest of those people because you're freeing them up to go and find another opportunity. And if you're going to be in this boat 6 months from now, then why not let them go out and find that opportunity now? And so, sometimes it feels like it might be, really tough because of that impact on someone could also be in their best interest. And it's certainly in the best interest of the other people who will stay on at the company and will continue to build to do that once and do it right the first time.
I think we've heard kind of similar sentiments from some of the founders at Venture Lane companies. For those who had to reduce the team size, a lot of the thinking was, if we're in a better financial position 6 months from now, this was not a performance-based decision. We'd love to have this person back, but honestly, we're hoping that they find a new opportunity much before then, and get along with their personal professional journey. So definitely hearing some similar sentiments across the board. Okay, so that
I'll add, since
Please.
we spend a lot of time on that, just one small thing, which is there is letting go people, but there is also salary cut, which I hope was discussed in parallel for that. So and usually that starts with the founders taking an act of leadership, being transparent. This is a cut I'm taking on me, and might be transfer to the rest of the team or everyone come up with their numbers. But the companies that have been the most successful in limiting the change of headcount are folks who are came around the table transparently. Here is where we are, and usually that works on smaller teams than larger teams where you need to do something more arbitrarily or the level of communication and transparency you might have might be a different level. But salary cut is something that I've seen being used. So perhaps the no change behind that, there is another element is, did you reduce your burn while keeping the same amount of people? And we've seen people coming around the table and taking it up to 70%, or just I keep my healthcare and everything moves on the side and I live for off my savings for the next few months. Because as a team, we want to be all together. That creates an amount of risk and requires a lot of transparency and proactive communication from the founding team as a whole. But that's the other element from letting go and changing headcount, especially in a COVID world where like you don't want to send someone and that's awesome that now you're covered, like your employer is going to pay if you have COVID later. And but that was like a few months ago. That wasn't transparent. That letting go someone without healthcare was something that was acceptable in some context.
Yeah. So important for leadership to lead by example in these cases, and be transparent in that communication and explain this is the situation that we're in, and here's the thinking behind some of the decisions that we're making right now. Okay, so that rounds out our discussion on Runway Health. We're going to move into our next discussion around impact, or the impact of the current crisis on growth. So to start out, we asked founders, in the last 60 days, has your monthly recurring revenue decreased, stayed the same, or increased? Simple question. 31% saying that they are reporting a decrease in MRR over the last 60 days, 40% reporting no change, and 29% actually reporting an increase in MRR over the last 60 days. For those who responded that revenue has increased, some of the most represented industries in that group were business intelligence tools, financial services, and e-commerce and retail. And for those startups who reported decreases in revenue, the industries most represented in that group were transportation or fitness and wellness related solutions. So panelists, the question here, first and foremost, changes to MRR, that sort of even distribution across the three categories. Surprised? Does those statistics seem realistic to you? And then across the portfolio companies that you are supporting, any additions you would make to industries that have found success in the current climate, and then industries you think are particularly impacted? So the green industries and the red industries, so to speak.
I'm curious how many of those companies that reported no change were companies that didn't have any MRR in the first place. So I wonder if many of those might be pre-revenue companies, but I think we'll say the same thing. Yeah, either they're pre-revenue, or I think we'll start to see them, head out to the barbell ends of decrease or increase, because there will be companies that do see some momentum. And then I think there are others that are just beginning to feel the softening now. Like, I think many companies had very strong first quarters, and even the beginning of the second quarter looked good. And so they almost couldn't imagine that sales were going to begin to soften as a result of COVID, because things look so good. But as their customers start to feel it, and their customers start to feel it, I think that revenue impact is going to hit more companies. And then these other companies that are feeling, that nice momentum are going to see even more of that momentum. So I think we'll see this kind of head out to the ends even more.
Sure.
I'm going to also say that given the fact that you had a lot of B2B companies in this as your kind of primary respondents, a lot of these companies have sales cycles that are 3 to 8 weeks. And so they might have been in the middle of a sales cycle. The business is going to conclude, the prospect's going to conclude that they ought to go ahead with the purchase. But the stuff that's at the top of the funnel, that sales cycle may lengthen. And so I'm not sure we've necessarily seen the impact yet of whether revenue is going to be up or down, simply because we haven't had enough time go by in the average sales cycle yet.
Yeah, makes sense. That's important consideration. So maybe a bit of a delay and a bit of a trickle down, as Sarah and Jay explained. Clem, any additional color to add?
I might add a positive twist, because of the data, which is enterprise SaaS subscription cloud tools, which has been the segment in the Techstars portfolio that has probably been has had some tailwinds. And so you see, so yes, as your consumer are being impacted. So thus you get impacted. However, since we're speaking here about subscription services, subscription services, enterprise SaaS, that's one of the segments where people are looking for digital tools to better work online. So there might be a bias in the data that like here you have 70% of the companies that have seen no change or increase. That also might come from the statistically that subsegment, which has had a lot of tailwind, because you have like the business intelligence, financial service, like e-commerce, retail. These are all these industries that de facto keeps their growth trajectory or increase out of that. But there is no doubt that even the ones who got a lot of tailwind, there are going to be some changes either in their customer base, even if they keep their growth, or like we're going to see in a few months, some alteration of the path they are on.
And amongst the CEOs that I meet with regularly, definitely that's been the case, that companies are trying to get more efficient because they have to reduce headcount. The only way to do that is to use digital tools.
Got it. So automation tools being very important, doing more with less, definitely a central theme in several of the conversations that we've been having as well over the last several weeks. Okay.
Also, two more growing industries. I think healthcare, naturally, there are a couple of companies that are seeing big wins in healthcare right now, and then also companies that are addressing labor market challenges. We're just seeing, millions and millions of people who are now suddenly unemployed, and so companies that are able to serve that population and help people reposition in the labor market where there is growing demand also seem to be doing well right now.
Jay, Clem, any other green industries to call out right now?
There is a lot that, and Sarah would love your perspective on it, like, which is like anything that is deep science, like that has cycles that are longer, like, or perhaps they're in a gray, like they've been not impacted way less because their cycles are so long. Bioinformatics, material science, like these are topics, like even their early commercial applications, since people are on 12, 18 month cycles. So they are also like somewhat saved from that current roller coaster right now.
Yeah, totally agree.
Okay. All right. So let's keep moving on. So now I'm just going to do a little bit of switching. So we are nearing the end of our Rorschach test section of this discussion. So we have two charts here for the group that has experienced negative growth or a decline in monthly revenue. This is the distribution that was reported. So as you can see, fairly even distribution. 25% of startups reporting a decline of 0 to 25% in MRR. Just over 20% reporting a decline between 25 and 50%. And then unfortunately, a bit of an uptick as you get into the bigger outcomes of a reduction of 50 to 75% or 75 to 100%. And then if we look at the positive growth group, not quite as even a distribution. Some of the outcomes are a bit more mild. So 55% or so reporting an increase of 0 to 25% in MRR, and then much smaller groups with larger outcomes than that, so 25 to 50 and so on. Panelists, any kind of like knee-jerk reaction to the shape of these distributions? Obviously not the most positive outlook as you look across both, but perhaps maybe any advice you have for founders that are experiencing those revenue headwinds at the current time.
I have to imagine we're seeing a correlation here between those industries that are seeing growth and those that aren't. And then Jay's comment around sales cycles and what your average sales cycle was before. So kind of where you're focused and what your sales cycle looked like probably has a big impact here. I think we're seeing some success with startups that have seen a decline in revenue and repositioning around cost savings versus value generation. So there's kind of an opportunity to reposition your marketing here around how you're helping your customers, and just to generally like double down on customer centricity. Like, who are those customers who still really highly value your product and what you've built and understand why, and just make sure you're serving them really well right now.
Yep. Clem, Jay, anything to add?
Jay is a master of enterprise SaaS, so would love to hear his perspective. Like, you have an expert on the panel, so I'll defer to Jay.
I'm not sure I have anything more to add. I think the data looks about right, and the fairly even distribution across the losses. And you're going to have a small number of companies that are going to benefit tremendously from the downturn, and then and they'll be maybe a little more skewed. So the data doesn't surprise me.
Okay. So then in that case, we can round out the discussion around how growth has been impacted.
And actually, just sorry to cut you, Ross. Tactically, there are a few questions that our NJ has been awesome at answering some of them directly in the Q&A. Do you want to take them as we go through the topics, or after?
So we're gonna take them all at the end just to make sure that we get through all the slides. And then, yeah, for all those tuned in, feel free to hover over the bottom toolbar. Clem, thanks for calling us out. Feel free to hover over the bottom toolbar. There's a Q&A button. Click that. You can type your questions in, and we will get through as many of those as we can in the last 10 minutes or so. So let's round out the discussion on growth. We also asked founders, when do you forecast a return to pre-crisis levels of leading sales activity and to revenue as well? We had 27% say 1 to 3 months, 39% say 3 to 6 months, and then smaller groups for the later timelines. So the question here for the panel, do we feel that these forecasts are a bit optimistic? Perhaps it's the case that we have some newer founders in the pool who haven't been through sort of the peaks and troughs that we're going through now, or is it possible that because we have such an early stage group, it's in some ways easier to achieve higher growth rates when you're starting at a smaller number to begin with? So if your MRR is just based on 1, 2, or 5 initial customers, to achieve double-digit growth is really just adding a small handful of customers thereafter. Thoughts there, Sarah, Clem, or Jay?
I mean, the overall piece, it's perhaps a little bit, I mean, nobody knows what is happening. What we know is right now we have markets that are behaving almost like before, but we have 30+ million people unemployed and all the ripple effects that there is behind, and some structural, just speaking about the US, not even worldwide, like anytime like you're in hardware, anytime like you're in supply chains, there are other dynamics that are happening, not speaking about oil and plenty of stuff. So it's a very complex equation with a lot of variables that are still at play, and with governments that are adjusting differently to these policies. So that, like saying like in 1 to 3 months, like there is no indication to be that optimistic. Understanding is Q3, Q4, like when we're past the summer, where are we at? Also TBD, earlier, like Sarah pointed out, like, hey, we're trying to see our portfolio in 6, 12, and even 18 months, like making sure that's like 12 to 18 months seems to be like what it needs to weather the storm, or like plan for the worst and hope for the best is overall the discussion that we have with so many companies, with the underlying discussion of, if we plan for the worst, like have your projection, like what does that look like to have a hit on 75% of your revenue? Here, that's a B2B discussion. Well, have a scoring card of your scorecard of your clients and the impact it had on your clients, even if they are keep paying right now. Like if you sell to the travel industry, we saw one of the most fantastic AI company we had in the last class that was selling to the hospitality world. And even if everything was green, the impact on their customers end up having a ripple effect on them. So it's less about like your own growth, but also understand the growth profile and the impact of the ecosystem that is around your company and the potential ripple effect. So that looks an extremely optimistic. I want to trust that, and I hope this is that. But that looks on the optimistic side, and then TBD how you define growth. And indeed, as you pointed out, early stage growth is like 1 more customers and grow by 100%. So that's another bias of the discussion.
Of course. So less important to predict when the return comes, more important to do your contingency planning and your scenario planning and understand what do we execute on given different possibilities of outcomes. Sarah and Jay, any other advice you would give to founders as they are doing their own scenario planning around the next 6, 12 months or whatever the timeline might be?
In addition to contingency planning and, planning for the worst and hoping for the best, which is great advice, I totally agree with Clem. For 66% of founders to feel like we're going to see a return in the next 6 months just feels like man, I'd love to be friends with you because I could use some of that optimistic energy right now, but it feels ambitious. But in addition to contingency planning, I think it's a great opportunity to figure out if there are any opportunities in front of you that weren't there before as a result of the crisis. I was on the phone with a founder this morning whose business has been impacted tremendously. He's focused on the travel space, and so everything in his category has ground to a halt. And for his team, they've just gotten incredibly creative to think about, how do we extend runway? How do we save this business? We believe travel will recover at some point. It'll look different, but we want to make sure that we're there when it does. And so what's it going to take for us to extend our runway to be able to do that? And as they've dug in as a team and started brainstorming about creative ways to drive new revenue, I think they may have landed on an even better business opportunity as a result of that brainstorming and creativity. And so it is an opportunity to go back and think about, were there partners who wouldn't have worked with us before, but now they're dying to work with us? Is there a new wedge in that didn't present itself before? So it's a great time to really be resilient and get creative.
Yep. Clem, Jay, anything to add around either contingency planning or finding new opportunities, new market segments, and acute pains to address in those segments?
No, I'm watching your clock for you. We probably don't want to spend too much time. Keep moving.
Appreciate that. Thank you, Jay. So one more quick sentiment to add here at the end, that last bullet point. So we also looked at the results of this question for the B2B group versus B2B2C and direct to consumer. And there was a difference here in the strictly B2B group being a bit more optimistic than the latter two. So maybe some indication that there's a concern of consumer behavior, individual consumer behavior taking a bit longer to recover. So now let's get into founder strategies, and we are going to move through these a bit quickly. First question that we asked founders who participated: which of the 5 strategies, or for the 5 following strategies, how critical is each for winning new business in the current climate? So what you see is essentially the ranking that came out of that. So number 1, introducing new product features. Number 2, redrafting marketing campaigns. Number 3, re-architecting sales strategy. 4, targeting new market segments entirely. And number 5, changes to pricing strategy. So a few bullet points on this category. You can certainly see that founders are embracing product-led growth. Looking at the number 1 ranking strategy. Another interesting insight, marketing more of a concern or having more urgency than sales strategy. And I know we had a speaker on a few weeks ago indicating that their top of funnel activity, not seeing a lot of changes, but it's once you get into the sales strategy and the conversion, that's where they really need to focus and optimize. So panelists, curious what your thoughts are on prioritizing top of funnel versus conversion in the current climate. And then 2 more insights to add here. A difference that we saw in the data between earlier and later stage founders. Later stage founders listed new features and new markets 1 and 2, and then everything else sort of a step below. So maybe seeing a bit of an interest in growing and creating flywheels in new markets now that they have well-established flywheels in their existing markets. Whereas with the earlier stage founders, maybe still having that focus on creating the initial flywheel in their initial target market segment. And then the final point to make here, we did have a free text option as well. And the loudest signal in that free text bucket was leveraging channel partnerships as a way to expand distribution right now. So for our panelists, Sarah, Clem, and Jay, a few different insights here. Agree, disagree with some of the bullet points on the right, and any surprises looking at sort of the ranking of strategies on the left. And we'll give everyone a moment to digest. It's a lot of information.
I'll go first. I'm sorry, Sarah, you wanted to jump? I think there's 2 things that I take away from this. One is that I see too often founders that think about their product more than they think about their business overall. And it's not surprising to me that the first thing to think about is, oh, let me go build something. And sometimes that's a solution, sometimes it's not. And I was actually kind of tickled to see channel partnerships as, the free text answer, because both of the other panelists know I'm a big believer in, find somebody who's already talking to the customer that you want to sell to, and find a way to help them sell more of their stuff if they help you sell your stuff. And so I think that's wise of folks to do that. I'm skeptical a little bit that simply creating a new product or switching from sales driven to product led growth is going to happen soon enough and be the exact solution. So it might be. So what they said, I'm not always skeptical is the right thing to do.
Sure. Clem, Sarah, anything to add?
In a period of high volatility, volume of activity actually trumps everything. Since you have like plenty of question marks, everybody has plenty of like, do I buy, do I not? Like, how do I evaluate this new product, this new initiative? Do I upsell? Like, I would assume like later stage founders like trying to upsell their existing folks, and so it's volume of activity is actually what we see. Like there's a correlation on the early stage in most of the Techstars companies, where the number of tries you put for that, so top of the funnel activities like become more and more important than ever. Like if you have the ability to rise above the noise, have the discussion, that's all it takes to so perhaps a product-led growth means less white glove service, but to be honest, right now it's about volume of discussion. Like again, B2B SaaS, how do you get your message out if in front of you there is a green space that was open? So feels right, and having the change of pricing strategy last TBD could be discussed because there is a lot of opportunity right now to let people buy for free and try actually. So I see a lot of enterprise SaaS like opening their trial for much longer or for sub-segment to be free forever, like in the healthcare, like we're supporting you. So that's like product-led growth might be tied to change of pricing strategy, like needs more clarity here.
Yeah. And we had Peter Zotto from ProfitWell and Kyle Poyer from OpenView. Really, really confident that extending trial periods right now and just going for product engagement over revenue in the near term was a great strategy for long-term growth. Sarah, anything to add?
I know this slide is about top strategies for new business, but I also would just encourage people to focus on retention. Love the customers you already have, and retention and expansion. Like, is there an opportunity to actually generate more revenue from customers that you already have in your midst? And then an observation on the pricing side. We were talking with a CEO of a mature late stage company the other day who said the very first thing he saw happen was that his large scale enterprise clients, their procurement teams obviously got a mandate that they had to go out and beat up their vendors. And so they came and they asked for better terms. They asked really to reduce pricing, and they just said no. They knew that was where the order had come from, like they go out and try to squeeze as much as you can. And then there's smaller companies who are companies that represent high growth potential for the long term were the ones who said, hey, can we just push this out another 30 days? Give us, net 60, net 90, a little bit more time to pay our bill. And where they really believed that those customers could weather this storm, they were happy to do that. So just be thoughtful about when you evaluate your pricing strategy, but also your terms for customers. What's driving it? And do you really need to do that in order to maintain that customer?
Of course. And a wonderful
3 minutes left. What do we want to say in 3 minutes?
Yeah, so what we're going to do is we're going to quickly look at the last two strategy slides. Q&A for all the folks tuned in. We won't reserve any time for this, but we'll quickly wrap up. We'll ask the panelists, what's the best way to get in touch with you? So that if you do have questions for Jay, Sarah, or Clem, you possibly get in touch with them after this panel and get some of those questions answered. So moving on ahead, we also asked founders, what are your top strategies for customer retention? 1 through 5 in order of ranking. We have introducing new product features. Again, maybe not so much of a surprise given Jay's sentiment around a lot of founders being excited to build product. Number 2, providing thought leadership. 3, more responsive customer service. 4, more frequent health checks, so proactive communications. And then 5, adjusting contracts terms like pricing or duration. So panelists, we'll just quickly go to you. Any surprises here? Any changes you would make? And I think a big surprise for us was seeing thought leadership ranked number 2 out of 5.
Because things have changed, there is opportunity actually to reprioritize things that you weren't doing. So I would be interested to see like thought leadership, or is there companies that were already doing that before or are taking the opportunity to do that? So that's something that pays on the long term and allows to rise above the noise. And yes, that's probably a number 1 good idea that we see across the board.
Yeah. Sarah, Jay, any other thoughts? Okay. All right. We had 2 slides here to go. We're coming up on the hour. So for all those who are tuned in, if you need to depart for your 1 o'clock meeting, please feel free. And if we have any panelists that need to depart for a 1 o'clock appointment, please do so. Otherwise, we'll stay on for just 2 or 3 more minutes to quickly finish up these slides. So our 3rd strategy question was, in terms of keeping your team motivated and productive while the team is dispersed, what are the most important strategies? I'll let panelists and I'll let attendees sort of read through these on their own. Really, the key insight here was the top 3 strategies have to do with communication. So communication is key, and most importantly, direct communication and frequent communication right from leadership. So Clem, this is definitely in line with what you expressed earlier. Very important for leadership to be communicating, to be transparent. Panelists, any other color to add here? Advice for founders who are leading their team through the current crisis?
Yeah, just to drive home that point, people are dealing with a tremendous amount of uncertainty right now, more uncertainty than they've probably ever faced in their entire life. And so people on your team are really hungry for clarity, any clarity you can give them, even if the clarity is to say, I don't know. And so just being really transparent with people, you might think about spinning up new communication channels, new communication modes. I know at Pillar, we have a weekly portfolio stand up now, which we didn't have before, just to make sure that we're continuously communicating with our founders. So think about new ways that you might need to communicate with your team to make sure that you're over communicating and creating plenty of transparency right now.
Wonderful, wonderful. And Jay, any final thoughts, and we'll wrap up with this slide here and do closing remarks.
Yeah, I was a little concerned around the deprioritization of social and personal time because I'm a little bit. I already see pretty strong evidence of Zoom fatigue. So I guess I'd say 2 things. One is, as you try to prioritize communications, also make sure that you're doing it in a way that you don't get people in a place where they can't handle it anymore. And number 2, you got to find ways within that to preserve your corporate culture. People work at startups not for pay. They work at startups because they believe in the vision and the mission of the company, and they are there because they want to be part of something that's going to succeed, and they like the idea, and they believe in the team and the people that they're with. And one of the risks here is that we lose that connection to the reason to be in the company. And if you lose that, you lose the people who are going to be killing themselves and giving 60 hours a week and doing this, working for less pay, and all that stuff that happens frequently in startups. So don't necessarily let go of the notion that you need to preserve culture somehow. At Techstars, during the last cohort, Clem will support the notion that we actually had on Wednesday nights official cocktail nights where people would dress up in a tux and bring in a martini and just sit in and do that kind of stuff to make sure that we preserve some of the connections. So don't let that happen. I'm personally not a huge fan of remote for all the time, forever. I think velocity decreases and corporate culture is harder to preserve. So work at it.
Wonderful. Wonderful. And we'll wrap up here our last and final slide, and we'll get one more sentence from each of our panelists. So we also asked founders, what are your greatest concerns in terms of getting your team back to business and back to those pre-crisis growth levels? And panelists, as you look through the list here, again, number 1 being greatest concern, 5th being least concern. Let's maybe just hear from each one of you to wrap up. First, what's the best way to get in touch with you if we have folks tuned in who might have some follow-up questions? And then second, your one piece of advice for founders who are expressing these top 1 or 2 challenges, the agility and the keeping morale high. So Sarah, let's start with you.
I think all of these things come back down to communication. And so just, making sure it's more important than ever that you check in with your team. I loved that Jay pointed out how totally sad and devastating it was to see the social and kind of like mental health deprioritized. My good friend Katie Burke, who's at HubSpot, wrote a post this week about taking a break and leaving loudly. And as a leader, you really have to lead by example and, take that time for yourself, show everybody on your team that you're doing it to protect your own mental health and well-being, but also check in with people, see how they're doing, see if they feel like decision-making has slowed, figure out where those bottlenecks are, see how they're feeling personally. It's more important than ever that you're really taking that time to touch base with your team.
Of course. And Sarah, best way for folks to get in touch with you?
So I shared my email address in the Q&A. I think we all did, but I'm Sarah, Sarah, @pillar.vc. And I'd love to connect with you on LinkedIn, but I probably won't write back to your message because I'm terrible at it. But shoot me an email, and I might be a little slow, and I'd love to chat over email.
Great. Clem, final thoughts and words of wisdom looking at the challenges on the board.
Well, agreed. Communication usually solves a lot. Just to share a tactical way, what communication means. So you can do all the all hands. You can, but that's communication not just with your teams. That's with your early investors, with your potential customers, your existing customers. Are you gonna go belly up or not? With your mentors. So the dynamic, it's more important than ever. Send to your team a weekly update. Every other week max, and send to stakeholders around your company an update every other week, every month max. At this point, like the more frequent, the better, because you're top of mind for everybody, and you don't know like you don't have all the answer. There might be like some bad news, but like the transparency is gonna lead to that adhesion and embracing like, hey, we're in it together. Jay highlighted, you're not in a startup, not necessarily just for the pay, far from it in most cases. And so that's for the feeling of building something together. So embrace that. It is not okay that number 3 is communication. Like just work on it. And if you're not a leader of your organization, well, be overly communicate and lead by example also to help everyone be together.
Important consideration. Jay, bring us home.
I guess my final answer is also remember what YouTube taught us all. People's video attention is shorter.
Yep.
So learn how to be crisp in your digital communications. Don't write emails to update your stakeholders that are 3.5 scroll screens long. Don't do hour and 45-minute talks. Do 12-minute or 7-minute things that people can consume. So learn to be efficient. Learn from YouTube. And I put it in the chat. I pretty much always respond to things at LinkedIn because I'm not behind a corporate domain name. I don't give out my personal email that often, but I will respond to LinkedIn. So you'll see the link there, linkedin.com/in/jbatson, J-A-Y Batson.
Wonderful. Clem, Jay, Sarah, thank you so much for making time today and an extra 7 minutes in addition and providing some ways for folks to get in touch. For all you tuned in, apologies that we couldn't get to Q&A today, but it looks like some of those follow-ups will be possible. Thanks for tuning in. Thank you again, panelists, and hope to see you all on another webinar coming up. Thanks, everyone.